Welcome to the last session of our open community. We've been talking about reaffiliating. We've been talking about preparing for general conference, and we've been dealing with some of the passages in the Bible that deal with same-sex relationships. And so we're going to wrap it up tonight. If you see Pastor Jerry Raridan anywhere, be sure to tell him thank you, by the way, for sharing. He's not going to be here with us tonight. He's actually chasing his grandchildren in Jeffersonville, I think is what he told me he was going to be doing tonight. But be sure to tell him what a wonderful job he did, because he did a phenomenal job taking a look at the different passages in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. So anyway, so tonight's topic, though, is where do we go from here? That's what we're going to be talking about. And before we get into that, though, let us begin with a prayer. Would you pray with me? Lord, on this beautiful night, we are grateful for the gift of spring and the gift of your presence. We ask that you would be with us in this space, and certainly we ask that your Spirit would grant us wisdom and grace and compassion for one another. We ask this in and through Christ. Amen. All right, so one quick kind of just housekeeping thing. You're probably wondering where the notes are. I don't have notes for you tonight. I have slides for you tonight. But what I will do in the weeks ahead, I'm going to write an article in our church newsletter that kind of summarizes what we talk about tonight. So if you want to go ahead to the next slide, Maggie. So what are we going to be doing tonight? Is it going to work? Oh, that's not it. Go back one. What's that? Oh, there it is. So tonight what we're going to do, we're going to recap where we've been the last few weeks. And I'm going to use the Wesleyan quadrilateral to do that. The theme of Open Community was, of course, leaning into our theology. And so really I'm going to lean into our theology as Methodists when we talk about human sexuality. And the four things we use as Methodists when we're thinking about God's will are scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. And so we're going to talk about each and every one of those topics, those ways of dealing with God's will when it comes to human sexuality tonight. We're going to talk about General Conference. And that, of course, is the highest legislative body for the United Methodist Church. They're the ones that make the church law. We're going to talk about our congregation here at Methodist Temple. So what do we think about this topic? And then we'll end with thoughts with Pastor Andy. That's what we're going to end with. So you go ahead to the next slide. Is it not working tonight, Maggie? Okay. So this is the part where I remind you the rules. We're a safe, non-judgmental community, and my translation, of course, of that is you have to be nice to Pastor Andy in order to get to heaven. That's the rule. With that said, though, let's just jump on in. And what I would like to do this evening is I want to recap the different verses we've talked about these last few weeks. Really, we've talked about 5 scriptures. We talked about 2 from Leviticus in week 2, and then we talked about 3 New Testament passages last week in week 3. And I just kind of want to reiterate some of the things that Pastor Jerry talked about when we're dealing with these passages that specifically address same-sex relationships. And in my first session, I actually said there's actually 6 verses, if you remember, that talk about same-sex relationships in the Bible. And the 6th one that we have not talked about is actually in a very small document in the New Testament called Jude. The verse in question is in Jude chapter 1, verse 7. And the reason we didn't deal with that is because in that document in Jude chapter 1, verse 7, really what the author does is he is talking about the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. And it connects that with sexual immorality. And so one of the things we learned about in our Old Testament session, if you remember, is that really the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah had more to do with the lack of hospitality. The sin of Sodom and Gomorrah had to do with the men of the city of Sodom wanting to violate the visitors and the strangers that were visiting Lot's house. And so really that's not a great argument when it comes to condemning same-sex relationships. So with that said, though, let's go to Leviticus. We'll talk about the Leviticus passages really quickly. The 2 passages in the Hebrew Bible that specifically address same-sex relationships they come from Leviticus chapter 18 and then Leviticus chapter 20. And I know that font might be small, but I'll just kind of talk about it. So that's it. In all the Old Testament, that's it when it comes to same-sex relationships. There are like 613 commandments in the Hebrew Bible, and we got 2. And specifically, it addresses the relationship between men. And then even more specifically, if you look at Leviticus 18, one of the things I'll point out about that particular passage is that the biology behind Leviticus 18 is an ancient biology that we no longer utilize anymore. It's not how we think about biology anymore. So what do I mean by that? Well, in the worldview and the understanding of how reproduction works in the ancient world, basically the idea was that men were like seed planters and women were like fields where the seeds were planted. I'm trying to just explain it very simply. And the technical term was monogenesis. And basically it's the idea that only males are the ones that are procreating in a sense. To use an analogy, it's just like planting a seed in your yard. Men plant seeds in women. That's how they understood the biology. And the reason why I point this out is because you see this in the context of Leviticus 18. In the verses right before it, it says, you should not lay with a woman when she's on her menstrual cycle. Why? She can't get pregnant. Just before that passage in Leviticus 18, it says, you should not have intercourse with your neighbor's wife. Why? Well, the field, if you're a man, the field that you're laying your seed in is someone else's field. Just to use a crude analogy, that's kind of what they're saying. You should not sleep with a male as one sleeps with a female. In the biology of the time, that's pointless. Why? Because they're not going to be able to procreate. And then you shall not have sexual intercourse with an animal. Again, pointless. And so Walter Brueggemann, which is a big name in Old Testament scholarship, points out that the whole list of banned practices in Leviticus 18 has to do with the idea that the male seed should not be wasted. I'm just the messenger. So anyway, all right. Yeah. So go back real quick. Let me hit on Leviticus 20 real quick, where the other passage comes from. Leviticus 20, it talks about same-sex relationships with men again. In Leviticus 20, what also happens is the author says that if 2 men are caught in that act, then they should be executed. They should be killed. So it's a capital offense. I'll just throw that out as well. All right, so let's go on to the next one. This slide comes from my professor, Marty Stussy. So Marty Stussy was my professor in seminary. She knows more about the Hebrew Bible than any person I really know. Maybe Rabbi Gary probably knows more than she does, but she's a great scholar. But she basically asks this question when it comes to the Old Testament Leviticus passages. She says, we tend to regard the Bible as a collection of morals, statements of what you should and shouldn't do. But there are demonstrable ethics underlying those reasons associated with these morals. And the question she asks is, does a moral still apply if the ethic is rejected? If the why behind the moral no longer is applicable, like the biology that they understood the moral in the ancient world, if that's no longer applicable, the question she asks is, should it be rejected? That's a fair question, I think. All right, let's go to the next slide. So what's the traditionalist say about these passages from Leviticus? Well, the traditionalist would say that Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20 are part of what they would describe as the moral law. And the moral law basically is the laws in the Old Testament that they think still are applicable. Pastor Jerry talked a little bit about this, but one of the things that Christians did with the Old Testament was that we took those 613 laws and we categorized them. We said some of them were moral, Some of them were ceremonial, and some of them were civil laws. The Bible itself, the Old Testament itself, doesn't do that with these. There's no designation like that. They're just 613 laws. But Christians, and thinking about what do we keep? What do we continue with? They begin to make that designation. Some of them are moral laws, some of them are ceremonial laws, and some are civic laws. So the moral laws, they said, the traditionalists would say, are timeless. So they always apply everywhere and always. The ceremonial laws, these are the laws in the Hebrew Bible that talk specifically a lot about sacrifice and worship. They no longer apply. And then there's civic laws, and that's kind of how they would organize themselves politically, really, are no longer binding either. So ceremonial and civic were kind of like cultural. They were specific to a time and place. They don't apply. But the moral laws, the traditionalists would say, are timeless. They continue on forever. And they should always apply everywhere and always. Now, here's the thing about this. They said that there were moral laws. They said there were civic laws and ceremonial laws, but they never defined what the moral laws were. They just said that the moral laws continue to apply. And so there's always been a great debate, like, well, which ones apply, right? Which ones apply? And sometimes people would say, like, the Ten Commandments apply. Those are timeless moral laws. And some would say passages like Leviticus would continue to apply timelessly. Describe those as moral laws as well. Does that kind of, I don't know, this is all very kind of complicated, but does that make sense? Are there any questions? Okay. I don't see any hands. All right. So the affirming group would say that using Leviticus 18 and 20 as a timeless moral law is not really consistent. They would point out the passages before that we don't follow, the passages after that we don't follow. The affirming group would point out that, especially in Leviticus 20, it says if a man lies with a man, they should be executed. We don't follow that part of that law either, so it's not really consistent, is what they would say. And so, yeah, they basically say, why is it that these passages are the ones going to apply everywhere and always when we don't apply so many other ones either? And that's kind of the affirming argument here. So, and I know as I go through, my bias is going to come out here. Like, if it hasn't already, I'm sure it already has. My bias is going to come out. But let's move on to the New Testament. Pastor Jerry did a great job talking about the two Greek words that we use, or that are used when it talks about same-sex relationships in the New Testament. And the first word is this is always hard for me, arsenokoite, and that word is arsenokoite is used in 1 Corinthians 6:9 and 1 Timothy 1:10. Arsen is male, and koite means bed. And you put the two together and you have male bed. Literally, that's what arsenokoite means. And there's a sexual connotation to the bed part. All right? But that's one of the Greek words that is used for, it's interpreted in many different ways, but that's one of the Greek words that some people would say refers to same-sex activity. You go on the next slide. Maybe. The next word is, while she's getting there, the next word is malakoi. And if you remember, that means soft ones. And the word malakoi is used in a lot of different ways, a lot of different contexts. But one of the common views is arsenokoite is referring to the active participant and then the male sex act. And then the malakoi is the passive person in the male sex act. And that's, some people would say that's why Paul uses those two together in 1 Corinthians 6:9. So that's where malakoi and arsenokoite come together, is in 1 Corinthians 6:9. And one of the ways, I'm not going to say this is the only way, but one of the ways those are interpreted as, one is describing the active participant, and the other one is the passive participant in that act. So, all right. And then the other passage that talks about same-sex relationships, and I will add, this is the only passage that talks about women when it comes to same-sex activity, is Romans chapter 1, verses 26 to 27. And Paul writes here, their women exchange natural intercourse for unnatural, and in some same way also the men. But the odd thing about Paul is he uses the same argument when he's talking about the length of people's hair. It says Does not nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it's degrading to him? And if a woman has long hair, it's her glory. So, and I actually looked up the Greek words, and they're basically the same words. He's making the same argument. And of course, we would look at the Corinthians passage and be like, well, that's judgmental of you, Paul. Why would you? No, we don't believe that. And yet then we'll look at the Romans passage and say, well, of course we're going to apply that. Some people would do that. And well, the question that comes again back to that question I asked earlier with the Old Testament passages, if the ethic that a person's using doesn't work, does the moral work too? That's the question. So I'll let you decide on that as we go through this tonight. So, all right. The New Testament, when it comes to these passages, would say that these New Testament passages condemn any sort of same-sex activity. Although I will say for the traditionalist group, they do not necessarily condemn same-sex orientation. And that's an important thing to point out here. The Bible does not have a concept of same-sex orientation. It's just not there. And so even the traditionalists would acknowledge that there is such a thing as same-sex orientation. We know that today. But the Bible doesn't have any talk of that. It doesn't mention that. It doesn't have a sense of that. And so the traditionalist doesn't necessarily condemn that part. But, of course, they do not condone same-sex marriage or ordination. All right, next one. And the affirming group would say that arsenokoite and malakoi, the translation of the word is unclear. This is going to be the affirming argument. They'll say, yeah, they've been interpreted this way at times, but really the translation of these words is pretty unclear. And Jerry laid this out in our presentation last week. Arsenokoite, remember, it meant male bed. It meant male bed is what that word means, literally. And so that could refer to men engaged in all sorts of non-procreative activity, like prostitution or pedophilia, or it could be interpreted much more broadly than just males having sex. And then malakoi is another word that's a little more difficult to interpret than what it typically has been interpreted. It can refer to men decking themselves out to attract women, going out on the town on a Saturday night. It could refer to unbridled lust and greed and luxurious excess, that kind of thing as well. So, yep. All right. We can go on to the next one. Maybe. Is this not working tonight? No. All right. I'm just going to use my notes. Oh, is it back? Okay. So, and I want to move through this. I want to get going here. So what about Jesus, though? oh, yeah, that guy. We've been going for 3 weeks, and we never talk about Jesus. That's fascinating to me when it comes to this discussion about homosexuality. Never talked about him yet. And the reason why is he never really directly addresses homosexuality. Never. In all 4 Gospels, nothing. He did, on the other hand, talk about divorce. We find Paul quotes Jesus on this in 1 Corinthians. That's probably the earliest thing that we have that Jesus said, as far as we know, comes from 1 Corinthians. And then in Mark, he talks about divorce as well. And basically, he says that you can't get divorced for any reason in the gospel, for any reason. And of course, we've moved on in terms of that because the church has been open to the possibility that people can get divorced for other reasons now. That's just a part of our culture now as a church. One of the things I'll say about Jesus, one of the things he did say about marriage is he did not necessarily think there was going to be marriage in heaven. I find this an interesting point to make. He said we're going to kind of be like angels in heaven. Gender's not going to be a thing. All right, remember you have to be nice to me to get to heaven? So here's the thing. If Jesus doesn't think there's going to be marriage in heaven, and gender's not a big thing, then why are we so worried about who's getting married to who? And why are we so worried about these conversations? just an Andy thing. Yes. I said Jesus said it, Bill. I didn't say Andy said it. Yeah, so, huh? Well, well, the reason why he says that is because it matters how the church treats people. That's why we're doing this. One other thing about Jesus. He did know Leviticus. We know that Jesus read Leviticus. And the reason why we know Jesus read Leviticus is because he quotes from Leviticus chapter 19. Go back. He quotes from Leviticus chapter 19. And when he quotes from Leviticus chapter 19, this is how he quotes it. Someone asked him, Jesus, what's the most important commandment? And he says, of course, you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's number one. That's called the Shema. Every Jewish person would have known that. And then he attaches another verse with it. You shall, what's the next one? Love your neighbor as yourself, right? Where does that come from? Does anyone? That comes from Leviticus 19. So Jesus knows Leviticus. He knows Leviticus. In fact, he quotes from the chapter in between the two chapters that condemn same-sex activity. He quotes from the chapter between those two. And he doesn't quote the ones that we want to talk about. He doesn't quote the ones we argued about. No, he quotes from Leviticus 19 and says, you love your neighbor as yourself. That's the one. Just saying. So, his overall ethic, I would say, is to be compassionate. As God is compassionate, we're to be compassionate as our Father is compassionate. I would also say that the affirming group would say, well, of course, and the traditionalists would say, of course. And of course, the big debate is, well, how does that work then? What's that look like? One of my favorite scholars, Marcus Borg, talking about compassion, said it this way. He talks about how the word compassion in Aramaic and Hebrew goes back to the word womb-like. And I found this is really cool because basically what does it mean to be compassionate? As God is compassionate, it means we're going to be womb-like. What's that mean? Well, he says we're life-giving, we're nourishing, we're embracing. As God is, so we are. And so that's what we're kind of talking about tonight. What does it mean to be life-giving, embracing, nourishing when it comes to the LGBTQ folks and the marriage of people, ordination of people? That's what we're talking about. So, all right. That's all I have to say about the Bible. So for now, if you have more questions, we can talk about that. Let's move on to tradition. So we talk about Scripture, and we'll talk about a little bit about tradition. I have to just say it. It's the truth. Christian tradition, by and large, has condemned same-sex activity, same-sex marriage. That's Christian tradition. To be fair, even today, even to this day, the majority of Christians worldwide do not condone same-sex marriage or activity. They just don't. The Catholic Church doesn't, and many other traditions in the world do not. But there are some notable exceptions. Reformed Judaism, that's where Rabbi Gary, that's his tradition. I guess I'm going outside of Christian tradition for a moment, but it applies. Reformed Judaism does. Then you can see the rest of the list: United Church of Christ, the ELCA, that's the Lutheran denomination. Conservative Judaism. So you might ask, what's the difference between conservative Judaism and Reformed Judaism? Reformed Judaism is the very progressive branch of Judaism, and conservative Judaism is kind of mainline-ish, is how I would describe them. The big difference between the two historically is the conservative Judaism group. They did not necessarily believe that Jewish people should marry outside of Judaism. That was the big debate. I think they've kind of changed that, but that was the big debate between the two. And then, of course, Disciples of Christ have sanctioned same-sex marriage, and the Episcopal Church as well. So these are some of the denominations that have said we believe same-sex marriage is okay. I did some research, and I was just curious, have there ever been examples of same-sex weddings in the history of the church, though, beyond just the 20th and 21st century? And what I found was the earliest instance we have found of a same-sex wedding happening in Christian tradition goes back to the 1500s. Anyway, This guy, Michel de Montaigne, I'm sure I'm not saying it right, but big philosopher in Western Europe, writes this in the 1500s. He says, on my return from St. Peter's, I met a man who informed me that on the same day, March 18, 1581, the Holy Week station at San Giovanni Porta Latina, in which a church a few years before, certain Portuguese had entered into what he called a strange brotherhood. They married one another, male to male, at Mass, at the same ceremonies which they performed at marriages. That church is it's in Rome. And there's a picture, you can go online, you can find a picture of it. I find it fascinating that this happened in the 1500s. Now, it's an anomaly. This is not the overall tradition. I will say that. But I find it interesting that there's some evidence to suggest it did happen. Very, very interesting. Which tells me this is not the first time we as Christians have dealt with this question, wrestled with this question. It's not the first time. So that's tradition. Let's go on to reason. So what does science say about gay and lesbian brothers and sisters in Christ? This is from the American Psychiatric Association. Core attractions, they say, form the basis of sexual orientation, typically between middle childhood and early adolescence. They arise, so orientation arises prior to sexual experience. Many people think that there's a correlation or some sort of connection between nature and nurture that plays complex roles. But the big part for me is most people experience little to no choice when it comes to their sexual orientation. Little to no choice. So, and this is backed up, if you go to the next slide, this is backed up when the church has tried what's been described as conversion therapy. That's done huge damage to people because you're asking them to go against who they are. So there's no scientific consensus that works. Also, there have been laws passed that said it's illegal because it's just not working. It's harmful to people. A story that happened to me many years ago now, a person came to talk to me and had gone through some of this, and the damage that they had gone through, the pain that they had gone through, because the religious tradition that they grew up in said no, and said, in fact, we're going to send you off to this camp, we're going to pray the gay away. Oh my gosh. It's awful. I'll never forget that conversation. Next slide. Maybe. Yeah. It's been documented, so there's homosexual activity in animals. It's common in mammals, in fact. One article, they document like 1,500 species. So the argument that says it's unnatural, it doesn't really hold up when you look at the world around us. It doesn't play out. And homosexuality in animals was cited by the APA, that's the American Psychiatric Association, in the Lawrence versus Texas case, which ultimately struck down sodomy laws in 14 states. So they cited that because that's one of the arguments. People will say it's unnatural. This is not how we're created. And then they said, well, it's in the world around us. You got 1,500 animals exhibit this type of behavior, so to say it's unnatural doesn't really hold water. All right? So, which brings us up to General Conference. So we've hit on Scripture, we've hit on tradition, we talked about reason. We're going to move into General Conference now. So, General Conference, of course, could take out the language that says homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. They could take out that language and the other rules associated with that in April. And what would that mean? Well, it would mean that United Methodist pastors could officiate same-sex weddings. It would mean that annual conferences could ordain openly homosexual persons, practicing homosexual persons. That's what it could mean. So why do we think that might happen? Well, here's the statistics. We have going to General Conference, we have 862 total delegates, 2 of which won't be seated, so they won't make it there, so they won't be able to vote. The U.S. has about 482 of those delegates, and we can firmly count that about 401 of those are inclusive, which represents 83% of the United States. This means it basically takes 431 votes for anything to pass by simple majority. And just so you know, the language that concerns the practice of homosexuality, to change that just takes a simple majority. To do some of the other regionalization stuff that Pastor Jerry talked about takes a little more, 2/3 majority. But long story short, it's highly likely that we were going to change our language concerning homosexuality in April as a denomination. Very likely. Because you got 400 votes from the United States. You got about 80 people we're not sure about. Some of those are going to come along with the affirming side. And then you got some people worldwide that's going to come along with the affirming side as well. So it's very likely that this language is going to change. So hence we're having this meeting. I just want you to know, I'm not trying to convince you either way. I'm not trying to tell you what to believe. You know where I'm at. You know where I'm at. I don't know how you could not know where I'm at if you've been here for the last 5 years. I don't know. But we're having this meeting so that you know that this is happening, and I don't want May to roll around people like, well, you didn't tell us. Well, I told you. This is going to happen. I'm going to write an article in a newsletter and say, this is going to happen. And so, anyway, so if that changes, what are people going to say? The traditionalist is going to say that it's not in line with Scripture and tradition. I've heard some traditionalists say that God cannot bless a denomination that sanctions gay marriage. That's their view. Some of the affirming people are going to say, if we only take out the language, that does not mean the harm is going to stop within the churches. If we take out the language, just to be clear, it does not mean that pastors have to do same-sex weddings. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that annual conference have to ordain practicing homosexual people. It doesn't mean that. It just means that there's the potential of that to happen. That's what it really means. The centrists would say that just to take out the language, it does allow for people's hearts to change. It still puts us in relationship, which I think, just me, I think that's a good place for the church to be in, because that's the place we need to be in. We need to be in relationship with people that don't necessarily agree with us. And the reason why that's important is because, I don't know about you, but I know about me, my heart has changed not because someone got up and gave a presentation about something. My heart changes because I'm in a relationship with somebody. That's how my heart changed. That's why I'm even up here. Because I had a relationship with someone. Because I went to school with some folks. I was a pastor to some people over the years. That's how my heart changed. And so I see this as being, it could be a positive. My dream for Methodist Temple, I'm kind of moving ahead. My dream for Methodist Temple is that people will continue to see how well we are able to do in terms of our ministry here. And then we'll think, you know what? Yeah, maybe we should be inclusive too. Yeah, maybe we should be grace-filled kind of like that too. Anyway. All right, next slide. So where's Methodist Temple at? Well, back in 2022, our executive board wrote this: we desire that our denomination, despite our differences, would remain united. We pray that General Conference would vote in 2024 to remove language in our discipline that concerns the practice of homosexuality so that we could collectively focus on our denominational mission. You're probably going to say, well, who's the executive board? That's our church council chairperson, that's our staff parish chairperson, that's our finance chairperson, that's our trustees chairperson, and then it's a lay leader. So back in 2022, when they decided to delay General Conference because of COVID, we crafted this statement. It was sent out via email and social media. So it's kind of a centrist position, technically. And then where am I at? Well, here's just some thoughts with Pastor Andy. So you kind of know, but I would say promiscuity leads to harmful places. I would first say that when it comes to sexual activity. One of the things I get frustrated with is when people say, if you're in the affirming camp, you believe just anything goes. That's just not true. Not true. We believe people like me would say promiscuity can take you to all kinds of harmful places. It's not a good thing. It's not the Christian ethic. I would also say, though, it's not good to be alone. And I take that language from Genesis in chapter 2. After chapter 1, Genesis chapter 1, God created everything and said it was good. Then I guess in Genesis chapter 2, God decides, well, maybe it's not that good. Because God says to Adam, it's not good for you to be alone. And then God creates, of course, Eve, the story goes. And if you go on and read in chapter 2, what's interesting to me is that chapter 2 doesn't talk about Adam and Eve and their relationship in terms of procreation. That's not the language that's used in Genesis chapter 2. Instead, it really talks about them just being together in relationship. It's not good for people to be alone. We all know that. We have an epidemic of isolation in our society today. We know that. This is just me. I don't believe it's reasonable to ask someone to act contrary to their orientation. I just don't see that as an effective thing or a healthy thing to ask people to do. And then the last thing I would say, marriage for me, in terms of my relationship with Leslie, has been a wonderful means of grace. It's helped me grow in my relationship with God. In fact, you know who really got me to get up and say something in the beginning? It was Leslie. It's Leslie. That's who did it. I'll never forget. It was 2019. The general conference thing happened. And she said, you need to get up and say something, Andy. I'm like, I don't know if that's a good idea or not. So, and I just finally got to say, I just can't. I want you to know I love you. I told the congregation, I want you to know I love you. I want you to know, I know that not all of you are going to agree with me. And I want you to know there's space for you here, but this is where I am. I cannot continue to let this happen for me personally, under my watch. No. I'm just not going to participate in that harm anymore, henceforth. And, well, that's what happened. So, yeah. But here's why would I keep any of these things from my gay and lesbian brothers and sisters in Christ? Why? Why would I not want them to be in a monogamous covenantal relationship together? Why would I tell them that you need to be alone? Why would I say, you're going to have to act against your orientation, even though this feels unnatural to you? Either you have to be alone or enter into a relationship that's not healthy for you. And then the big one as a pastor, why would I want to keep you from something that helps people grow in their relationship with God? Why would I want that? I don't want that for anybody. If it wasn't for my wife, Leslie, I tell you this, I would not be the Christian I am today. No way. And why would I want someone else to miss out on having a spouse like that in their life? I just don't. And so, that's me. All right. 7 o'clock. Questions?
Right, as Pastor Andy gets ready to answer some questions, you've got this
book you
wanted
thank you.
to talk about first.
We have a book for you if you have any questions, I'll answer them. But Easter, post-Easter, this is our study. This is our book that we're going to be giving out tonight. If you're interested in an Easter anthology, Cass is going to help us lead this study. And it's got some of my favorite authors in it, Henry Nouwen, Richard Rohr, people like that. So if you want to pick up your book tonight, sign up for the class. That's going to happen post-Easter. You can do that tonight.
All right.
All right.
I hope you have some questions because I haven't been able to be here. I've been at work at my other job. But I listened to every one of the podcasts, and there weren't very many questions. And so don't be shy about questions or comments. One of the things, I'm going to show you guys something. One of the things that Pastor Andy and I have tried to do is to get down onto your level and not make the sermons so much of a monologue, but that it be more dialogical. One thing that we've done symbolically is we've already come down. If I'm standing up here, I've already come down 1, 2, 3 steps to try to come off of that perch to get down here. Now, we're still 4 steps ahead of you, so don't get too sassy about it. We're still up here. But that's my way of saying, come on, let's have some questions and let's have some comments. I know you have to have questions, and it's safe, right? It's really safe. So who has a question? Who's got the first question or comment? Okay.
This is not a question, but it is a comment. I'm left-handed. I had no choice about being left-handed. It's just what I am. And about 10% of the population is. And I think people with same-sex orientation are the same way. They have no choice.
Thank you, Phil. I'm left-handed as well. Okay. Another lefty. Another question or a comment?
My comment is that in all my years of my life, people need love. And the Bible talks about love. I'm not a student of the Bible, but to love and be loved is one of the greatest joys we can have in life.
Thank you, Margaret. All right. Around.
I grew up in a very loving family and had no knowledge of same sex or same gender, whatever, until I was in the service. And there's 2 guys that I liked them, no big deal, but asked me to drive them to Philadelphia and proposition me. And I said, no, I don't think so. and that's the first experience I ever had with that kind of contact. And it was no pressure. They just asked. I was going to New London to see Jane, my girlfriend, and they thought, well, we thought that was made up. But it's never, it isn't something I don't think about. It doesn't matter. It's what they used to say in Vietnam, Mox Nix.
Okay.
Thank you, Bill.
Linda Quinn has one.
All right.
Yeah.
I just want to know if the book is involved with a class that's going to be online on Sundays. Is that the same class you're talking about?
I think so, yes. Yep. Yep.
Any other questions, comments? Anything at all? Okay.
So prior to coming here, my wife and I and our 3 kids church surfed. We never felt comfortable. We stepped into this place, and this has grown our family, our hearts, the love that we have, and this place has made us not only better people, but we're happier, and it's. Thank you, Andy.
Well,
Thank you.
I don't know why I'm doing this, but one of the things that I've kind of observed, and you guys have kind of referred to it, is we as people, and I'm old, so I'm going to talk about all of us old people. I think for years, because a lot of this came up in the 50s and the 60s when we're growing up, 40s, 50s, 60s, is a fear. And if you don't know other people that aren't like you, whether they're LGBTQ or African American or Chinese or Asian or Korean or whatever, I think a lot of people have a fear about those situations because they don't understand them. They don't know them. I can't necessarily say that I did. I know my father did. And until he got to know some different people, ethnicity and everything else, yeah, he was pretty closed-minded. But to reach out and be able to know people as people, not with any other judgment, which is one of the reasons that I went ahead and made sure that I came here and stayed too, is because it is a safe, non-judgmental space. And I really appreciate that. And I have some guys who live next door to me that are, since now I'm alone, have been helping take care of me. So I think it's just reaching out and getting to know other people, whether they're like you or not. Doesn't matter if it's a disability or what it is.
All right. Well, if you have any more questions, you maybe can catch me afterwards. And I want to be mindful of time. And selfishly, bedtime in my house is 7:30. So it goes better if we get there by 7:30. So, let me just say a few more things real quick before we wrap this up. First, this is not an easy topic, I know. If you're part of the LGBTQ community, and I said anything hurtful along this journey, please talk to me about it. Certainly that's not my goal. I'm just trying to encourage people to be as grace-filled as we can. So that's my goal. And certainly if you disagree with me, you can come talk to me as well. I want you to be able to know that you can do that. I know that there's people with strong convictions on the other side of this conversation, and I certainly understand that. But my goal tonight is just to be authentic and be honest with where I'm at, and I don't think I surprised anyone. But anyway, yeah. And the last thing, I don't know. Go in peace. How about that? I want you to go in peace.